Today we have some more actual history about the old days in the American West. We will be reading about an Indian fighter who fought both with the U.S. Army and on his own. He lived primarily in the Montana region, and he was known as Liver-Eating Johnston. His real name was John Johnston. He got the name liver-eating from accounts that stated that he would cut out and eat the livers of Indians he killed in battle. We will be reading from the spring 1983 issue of Old West magazine. There are two articles in this issue of Old West that we will be reading. The first is an excerpt from the 1958 book, Crow Killer, the Saga of Liver-Eating Johnston by Raymond W. Thorp and Robert Bunker. We will then read the article, The Truth About John Johnston by Harry J. Owens. The second article attempts to dispel many of the myths about Liver-Eating Johnston that are presented in the first article from the book, Crow Killer. So first we will hear about the traditional legend of Liver-Eating Johnston, and then we will read the second article, which attempts to dispel some parts of the legend that are not true. The Myth of the Crow Killer, from the book Crow Killer, the Saga of Liver-Eating Johnston. One May morning in 1847, Crow Indians killed and scalped John Johnston's pregnant wife. For many years thereafter, he killed and scalped Crow Indians. Then he ate their livers raw. He ate them not for hunger's sake, but upon principle. What principle his whole life history may suggest. Other tribes than the Crows could arouse his anger. The Blackfeet indeed once shamed and mistreated him, their captive. But one tribe only did Johnston dreadfully humiliate. He was Dapiak Absroka, the killer of crows. As such he was feared. His fame served him almost as a weapon. Indians ambushing him with every tactical advantage broke and ran when he killed but one of them. As Crow Killer he might expect captivity and therefore the chance to escape when taken by other tribes, who would naturally hope to sell him dear to his special foes. On other occasions, as an awesome ally, Johnston could turn tribe against tribe and take for himself, in the warfare that followed, a highly profitable harvest of scalps. His first insane lust for revenge was surely real, whether provoked by the death of one he loved or by mere hurt to his pride. But the reputation it brought him was to be an extraordinary business asset. As John Johnston, the young trapper, had already won a name for his strength and quick learning of wilderness ways. Force and cunning, however, were mere details in his new repute as Liver-Eating Johnston, one whom the Indians could consider as obsessed, divinely mad. Johnston, or Johnson, talked but little, and this added to his fearsome personality. He was known as surly, uncommunicative, mistrustful, yet from the beginning he was willing to talk when necessary, to set the record straight and inform his companions of things they could not see for themselves. He fell in first with old John Hatcher, a famous but loquacious trapper, who admired him and delighted to spread stories about him. In some of these first stories, Johnston was portrayed as simply the greenhorn. He had been cheated by that sly trader Joe Robidoux, and he had allowed Hatcher to steal upon him at his campfire, apparently unobserved. Yet as the same stories went on, somehow the greenhorn had beat Robidoux in a horse trade, and had seen more quickly than Hatcher that a supposedly dead Indian was actually alive, ready to leap on them. Johnston chose as his longtime partner a trapper even more concerned with spreading his fame, Del Gue. Del, though, as he put it, knew when not to ask questions. However, he did manage to obtain answers necessary to the legend. Del went along with Johnston on his pilgrimage to the cabin of John Morgan's feared widow, Crazy Woman. Del witnessed the killing of the last of the 20 warriors whom the Crows dedicated especially to Johnston's destruction. Del was not ashamed to relate his own queasiness when livers were plucked out and devoured. He also lived to tell his story even after Johnston's death of old age, in the middle 1880s and again in 1900. He told it to J.F. Anderson, or White Tie. The materials for legend were surely ready to hand. John Johnston's shrewdness and fantastic strength were of course the natural aptitudes of Liver-Eating Johnston. Crazy Woman's shrill keening for her dead each night come sundown was of his chorus of the fates. His unfortunate enemies, the Crows, were tribesmen generally admired for their wisdom and dignity, and their marking of 20 heroes to seek vengeance individually against one Dapiak has in it their own sense of high drama. Johnston's associates too, mountain men who were given the opportunity, joined in his feuding, and set off the Crow killer's bloody history with their own eccentricities. As background against which the liver eater's exploits might be savored and judged, there was the tradition of the private grudge. Should a trapper beset already by unending work and harrowing danger choose to run still further risk of bullet, tomahawk, or even the stake, certainly there was no one to deny him that privilege. Liver-eating Johnston was not the first in frontier history to take a trail of vengeance against the Indians, though possibly he was the most spectacular. Blackjack the Juniata and Louis Wetzel won special renown for such vendettas, and there were others of the vengeful Nick-of-the-Woods type, too many by far to mention here. Surely as mere killer of Indians, mere bloody-bearded eater of men's livers, the Crow killer would be worth little investigation. We could easily dismiss him as inhuman or insane, but he was not simply inhuman or insane. He was not even simply cruel. He cannot be so easily understood. Rather, we may see him stepping back from the barbarities of others of his kind, almost as if they offended his sense of order. They, in turn, at times, seem more troubled by his choice of liver than by his mere cannibalism. And though Johnston did express the generalized contempt of his era in regard to Indians, we shall observe repeatedly his very real respect for the warriors of many tribes. Even as in his heyday he was above all the killer of crows, a time did arrive in his terrible vendetta when, in sheer admiration of Crow magnanimity, he ceased his dreadful feuding, and became their brother in arms. So that is the end of the excerpt from the 1958 book, Crow Killer, the Saga of Liver-Eating Johnston. I will now read the article written for Old West Magazine by Harry J. Owens, titled, The Truth About Liver-Eating Johnston. When John Johnston received the patent for his homestead south of Red Lodge on February 4, 1897, it was recorded John Johnston, not John Johnson. On his several applications for military pension in his later years, he always signed his name John Johnston. Therefore, throughout this narrative of the life of one of the West's most colorful personalities, the name will be Johnston. John Johnson is not correct. There never was a Jeremiah Johnson. Where Hollywood dreamed up the name Jeremiah is not known. Perhaps it was some public relations person who had a biblical vision. In the space of a few pages, it is difficult to fully describe the exploits of this remarkable man. John Johnston was not a blowhard, nor did he try to promote his own image, as did some others. It would do well to dispel the myth that John Johnston was a bitter enemy of the Crow tribe, sworn to vengeance because of the murder of his Flathead wife by Crow Indians, while Johnston was out hunting. Also a myth is the story that Johnston cut out Indian livers and devoured them, gaining the name Liver-Eating Johnston. There is no record at all of Johnston's supposed vendetta against the Crows. On the contrary, he was a great friend of the Crow Indians, with whom he lived much of the time. They called him Black Bear and made him one of themselves, coming to him frequently for counsel, and asking his aid in their many wars, particularly against the Blackfeet. If any tribe had it in for John Johnston, it was the Blackfeet, because of his participation in these revenge raids. For 10 years they tried to get him without success. One time, however, they nearly got him, at a spot on the Missouri River. 3 Piegans or Blackfeet came upon him suddenly, and rushed in to take him. With one tremendous swing of his rifle, Johnston knocked 2 of the Indians down, and then he ran like the wind for the safety of the nearby post. Further, in an early letter, Johnston wrote in part, I deny that I am or ever was a squaw man, or ever kept a squaw or wife or otherwise. Any statement to the contrary is a malicious falsehood. This should put to rest the false legend of the Crow Killer. According to Johnston's Civil War enlistment record, he was born in Henderson County, New Jersey, in the year of 1830, although some of his later application for pension papers show him as being born in 1824. His death certificate, recently discovered in California after a long search, shows his age as 76 in January of 1900, so he would have been born in 1823, which is probably correct. At a very early age, he shipped on a whaling vessel, but after a few voyages he enlisted in the United States Navy, and was in that service during the Mexican War. The only incident he related of his naval experience was an act of insubordination, which was to his credit. A lieutenant, son of a commodore, struck one of his comrades a bad blow with the flat of his sword, whereupon young Johnston then struck the officer a stunning blow in the neck, stretching him senseless on the deck. The officer, upon recovering, did not know who had struck him, but suspected Johnston. None of his comrades would testify against him, however, so he escaped capital punishment, which would have been his fate for striking a naval officer. For 30 days he could get no shore leave, but when he finally did receive liberty, he never returned, and drifted to the western country. The outbreak of the Civil War found Johnston in Colorado Territory. He then enlisted in St. Louis, Missouri on February 24, 1864, and was assigned to Company A, 3rd Regiment of the Colorado Volunteer Cavalry. He served in Price's command as a teamster. On April 23, 1864, he was assigned to Company H, 2nd Regiment, Colorado Volunteer Cavalry. He received a gunshot wound in the left shoulder at Westport, Missouri. He was also in engagements at Little Santa Fe, Mine Creek, and Newtonia, all in Missouri, in pursuit of Confederate troops. At Newtonia he was wounded again with a gunshot in the right leg, below the knee, and was hospitalized in Kansas City for a time. He was mustered out on September 23, 1865, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Recovering from his wounds, Johnston again headed west, turning up in Bannock, Montana. From that time until the end of the Indian Wars, he had an adventurous life, either as a scout with the Army or as an Indian fighter on his own. It was William T. Hamilton, Uncle Billy, the great sign-talker and himself one of the bravest frontiersmen, who gave Johnston the credit for being as brave and cool a warrior as ever drew a bead on an Indian. There is more than one story about how John Johnston acquired the sobriquet which he carried to his grave. The most accurate version came from the man himself, and here is Johnston's version of how he became known as liver eating. We was attacked by Injuns and we licked 'em good. There was 15 of us and we killed 36 of them and wounded 60. It was toward the close of the fight that I got my name. I was just getting my blood up and feeling like fightin'. We was short of ammunition, and as I saw an Injun running toward the cover, I threw my gun to Bill Martin and took Bill's knife. I wasn't going to waste no cartridges on him, for I could lick any Injun I could lay my paws on. I was considered the best shot with a rifle in Montana at that time, but I wanted to save my cartridges. We had a 300-yard run to the bushes, and I caught the Injun by the hair of the head and threw him down just at the edge of the brush. I danced and sang on the Injun's body, for that's what they done to a party of whites a few days before. Then I scalped him, and then I danced and sang some more. Then I ran my knife into him and killed him, and part of his liver came out with the knife. Just then a sort of squeamish old fellow, named Ross, came running up. I waved the knife with the liver on it in the air, and I cried out, "Come on and have a piece, it'll stay your stomach till you get home to dinner." "Don't want none," says he. "Come on," says I, dancing around. "I've et some, and it's just as good as antelope's liver. Have a bite." And I kind of made believe take a bite. Then Ross threw up his guts, and he always swore after that he seen me tear a liver out of a dyin' Injun and eat it. But that ain't so. I was all over blood, and I had the liver on my knife, but I didn't eat none of it. The liver coming out was unintentional on my part, but Ross vowed 'twas so, and I never got rid of the name. This encounter with the Sioux took place on the Musselshell River near its junction with the Missouri River. The year was about 1870, and there were 2 parties of white men, 15 in all, camping there cutting bull pine and cottonwood for the steamboats. The story as told by others is as follows. One morning, Crow Davis and his squaw happened to be the first up in one of the camps. They were a short distance from the camp getting wood for the breakfast fire, when suddenly the squaw told Davis in a low, frightened voice, as she continued to pick up wood, that the camp was surrounded by Indians. Davis was shrewd enough to show no sign of his knowledge of the danger, and after picking up a few more sticks of wood, walked slowly back to the camp, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The squaw kept on gathering wood to keep up the bluff. All the time, her cunning black eyes were searching the surrounding woods for signs of Indians as she slowly worked herself back toward the camp. But the strain was too much for even her stoical nature, and finally, a moment after Crow Davis reached the camp, she gave a frightened scream, dropping her armful of wood, and ran for the camp. She never reached it. When she was about halfway to it, a bullet from an Indian's gun found her and stretched her on the ground, a victim of too much courage or too little fear. The wound was not fatal, however, and she lived for many years afterward. Johnston then developed his plan of attack. 3 men with Winchesters were sent across the river to take up a protected position, which commanded the coulee, while Johnston divided up the rest so that no avenue of escape from the coulee was left open for the Indians. After the men were all placed, the fight began, and it was very lively. It was a complete surprise to the Sioux, who were picked off like rats in a trap by the men across the river, and when an Indian would stick his warlock above the bank of the coulee, he at once became good and virtuous. The men across the river did not waste a shot. When the Indians found that escape was hopeless and that they were being slaughtered, they began to dig holes in the bank as protection against the murderous fire. But this availed them little, as the white men would merely change their positions and find them out. The Indians then demanded a powwow. They wanted to quit and call the affair a draw. Johnston would make no terms. The Sioux must be treated to a dose of their own medicine. For some time afterward, the whites kept potting the Sioux in the coulee, while the Indians were unable to do any damage at all with their arrows and the few guns they possessed. Finally, they decided to take a desperate chance and rush in a bunch from their trap. Johnston had observed their maneuver in the coulee and posted most of his men in a little hollow toward which the remaining Indians were heading. The men across the river kept raking the running Indians with a deadly fire. Then, when in close range and not 100 feet from the hollow, they ran into such a merciless hail of lead that they were mowed down like the blades of grass. One volley, the fight was over, and dead Sioux were stretched across the plains, a good day's work for a little band of 15 plainsmen. But the affair was not yet completed. Quite a number of the wounded had crawled off to hide in the bottoms along the river. It was decided not to let a single one escape, as it would mean certain death for members of the white party. Some Indians begged piteously for life, and others received the finishing stroke with the traditional stoicism of their race. Johnston found one buck as he was crawling away towards the prairie, seriously but not fatally wounded. He trailed him for some distance by the blood splashes on the ground and grass. As the Sioux warrior heard Johnston approach, he turned to make a last desperate fight for his life. Johnston was upon him in an instant, but found the Indian was unarmed and defenseless. Johnston dropped his rifle and pulled out his hunting knife, and felt its edge on his nail. Seizing the Sioux by a big brass ring in his ear, Johnston threw the Indian over his bended knee, and twisting his head around until every cord and muscle of his neck was tense and taut, gave it one quick, ugly sweep of the knife. He walked quickly back to his comrades, his rifle in one hand and the bloody knife in the other. When he reached the group, one of them, a pilgrim, noticed a little strip of flesh hanging from the knife blade and asked what it was. "That," said Johnston, "is a piece of Indian liver. I just had a feast off of one and thought maybe some of you would like a taste. Try it." Johnston himself pretended to be eating the liver, but actually had thrown it to the ground. But the others could see the red patch across his beard, and thought he had actually eaten the liver. From that day on, he was known far and wide as Liver-Eating Johnston. John Johnston was attached to General Nelson Miles's command at Fort Keogh, Montana, in 1877. This was immediately after the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Custer Massacre. Miles sent Johnston and 10 men out to locate the Indians. They found them in force behind a hill, so the whites retreated to another hill which afforded some protection, and the Indians attacked. The white men, being well armed and under cover, withstood a number of vicious attempts by the Indians to dislodge them. During the day's fighting, the Indians suffered more than 40 killed, while Johnston's men escaped without a single casualty. When night came, the Indians withdrew, and the scouts were able to make it back to General Miles's camp. Johnston advised Miles to withdraw his forces, and Miles heeded the advice. Miles broke camp and marched away with his small force. The next day, a strong body of Cheyennes joined the main force of Indians that had been held off so successfully by Liver-Eating and his men. By the time the Indians reached the spot where the soldiers had camped, Miles and his men were far away. Men who were familiar with the situation always claimed that Johnston and his men saved General Miles and his small force by the gallant fight they put up and by the timely advice Johnston gave Miles. In the winter of 1868, Johnston, having had little luck trapping, joined with ex-Beadler of Montana vigilante fame in cutting cordwood for the Missouri River steamboats. In the spring of 1869, the steamboat Nile stopped at Johnston and Beadler's woodyard at the mouth of Musselshell to purchase cordwood. The two men were taken on board and entertained, the occasion being the captain's birthday. Ice cream was served in the captain's honor. Neither Johnston nor Beadler had ever seen or heard of ice cream, and its coldness in the afternoon heat caused them to regard it with suspicion. Johnston asked his partner in a whisper, "X, where in the hell does this stuff come from?" "Shut up, you fool," growled Beadler, bravely swallowing a spoonful. "It comes in cans." Among the boat passengers were several ladies, who were spending the summer viewing the West. Their curiosity led them into conversation with Beadler and Johnston, who resented being patronized as if they were a couple of Sioux. One of the ladies inquired of Beadler, "Mr. Beadler, are you married?" "Yes," grunted Beadler. "Oh, indeed? Do you know I hardly thought that? Is your wife, a white woman?" "Indian." "How delightful, a native of the Great Plains. Where is she now?" "I've sent her to Rome." "To Rome, to be educated? Just think of such devotion," she declared to her companions. "Mr. Beadler, do you mean to Rome, Italy?" "No," answered Beater grimly, "to Rome on the prairie." This ended the conversation abruptly. During the heyday of the Wild West shows, Johnston was offered a part in a show that was trying to emulate the success of Buffalo Bill's. This show had Indian chiefs, a few sharpshooters, and Johnson was advertised as the avenging fury of the plains. The show went broke in Iowa, and Johnston walked back to Montana. Although the show went broke, Johnston made a very favorable impression on Easterners, and his name became quite well known. Shortly after his return, an article appeared in a St. Paul, Minnesota newspaper in which an unnamed officer of General Howard's command belittled Johnston's role in the campaign against the Nez Perce in 1877. Johnston could not let such a degrading article go unanswered, and wrote in part to a Billings, Montana paper in 1884 as follows. In the Pioneer Press of the 21st instant, nearly a column is devoted to a sketch of myself and some of my adventures as detailed to a credulous reporter of that paper by a Jim Crow subaltern of the 7th Cavalry. The smart aleck who undertakes to tell the Pioneer Press about me has not the manhood to back up his claims by stating his name. However, I suspect who he is, and am inclined to think him as big a poltroon now as he showed himself to be when a petty lieutenant in the Nez Perce War. I was leading scout and guide of Sturgis's command, and part of the time for Howard's and at times for both together. Both these officers during the campaign and after its close gave me the highest praise for my knowledge of the country, skill in guiding troops, and bravery in a hostile country. So far as sand goes, I don't need to go to any second lieutenant for it. I have been in 40 different Indian fights and have fought them from California to the Gulf of Mexico. I have killed more Indians than all the officers of the 7th Cavalry put together, throwing in their regiment for good measure. If the dirty, cowardly officer who tried to stab my reputation will publish his name, the first time that I strike his trail, I'll make him think a section of the Day of Judgment struck him. My adventures and my conduct are known pretty well through the West, and I don't need to go away from home to get a certificate of good character. But it does rile me when a whelp of an officer that was nearly scared to death in one little campaign comes barking and snarling at my heels, when I can count twice as many coups as he can toes and fingers. Liver-Eating Johnston was a magnificent specimen of manhood. He stood over 6 feet tall and weighed 220 pounds of solid brawn and muscle, which his arduous life had hardened into the strength of steel. Fatigue was almost unknown to him, and he had greater endurance than most Indians. His personal appearance was striking, with a shaggy growth of jet-black whiskers and an enormous head of long hair. Cold, shrewd, steel-gray eyes were true indices of character. Johnston did not affect the fancy dress of some frontier dandies. He was usually clothed in buckskin, but it was simple and inornate in the extreme. His appetite for meat was phenomenal. One winter while wolfing on the Marias River, northwest of present Great Falls, Montana, he killed and ate 13 buffalo. He shot them and hung them up near his cabin at the beginning of the season. When spring came, there was very little left. The next few years, Johnston continued his trades of trapping, placer mining, scouting, and fighting Indians. In 1881, he was appointed deputy sheriff at Colson, Montana Territory by Sheriff Tom Irvine of Custer County. Quite some time had elapsed after his appointments, and he had still sent no prisoners to the county jail. Colston had a reputation as a wild town, so Sheriff Irvine went to investigate. He found the town fairly quiet, and asked Johnston, "Say, John, why haven't you been sending in the prisoners you have arrested?" "How in hell could I arrest anybody?" asked Johnston in great surprise. "You know there ain't no jail here to put 'em in after I arrest 'em, so I don't arrest anybody. I just beat hell out of the ones that should be arrested and turn 'em loose, and I've never had to arrest the same man twice." When the railroad reached Billings, Colson ceased to exist, and Johnston moved to Billings. Johnston gave up enforcing the law in Billings and moved to an island in the Yellowstone River, where he raised cabbages. When they matured, he took a load to Billings, but was offered only 3 cents a pound, which he refused. "I sweated over them damned cabbages all summer long for 3 cents a pound. I'll go build me a cabin in the mountains where I can kill all I want, and I'll never work again," he told a friend. Johnston then moved to Red Lodge, Montana. He homesteaded about 3 miles south of town, taking up 160 acres, patent signed on February 4, 1897, by President Grover Cleveland. During the summer of 1894, Ben Greeniff was gathering timber in the mountains and stayed with Johnston in his cabin. George Haywood, who also visited there, remembered that he had a nice garden, potato patch, and raised some hay. Johnston was appointed the first constable in the new town of Red Lodge, and served several terms. Here he followed his unique methods of enforcing the law. Ben Greeniff recalled, "I remember one time I was in the old saloon, George Howard's, near the present site of Mountain View, called Jack the Ripper. There was 2 little old Scotch miners drunk and fighting on the floor. Johnston happened to pass by, looked in and saw them, came in and picked them both off the floor, one under each arm. There was only 1 plank sidewalks and a hitch pole. Johnston walked out with those 2 men under his arms, fighting and cussing, laid them across the hitch pole, banged their heads together, dropped them both in the dirt, and walked off and left them laying there. I thought he had killed them. They laid there a few minutes, then both got up, put their arms around each other, fight all out of them, and sober by that time." The late Fred Longmore was a young lad when he knew Liver-Eating Johnston. One day he asked, "Mr. Johnson, did you really cut out an Indian's liver and eat it?" "That's what they say, sonny," Johnston replied. The late O.J. Salo also carried fond memories of the old Indian fighter. "He gave me nickels several times and always told me, 'Kid, don't spend that for anything but licorice.' The second time he gave me a nickel, he called me Snowtop. I had white hair then." When boys who didn't have any money wanted to see a show at the Finn Opera House, Johnston would hoist them on his shoulders, and older boys already in the hall would pull them into the balcony, and they saw the show for nothing. The end of the century loomed, and so did life for Liver-Eating Johnston. On December 9, 1899, his health broken, and without funds, John Johnston, famous scout and frontiersman, departed for the California Soldiers' Home. Fred Longmore wrote, "I grew to be a friend to Mr. Johnston, and he was good to me, and very kind. I went to the depot with Fred Swope and Mr. Potter when Mr. Johnston went to the old Soldiers' Home in California." A story in the Carbon County Democrat is evidence of the esteem that the citizens of Red Lodge had for the old man. John Liver-Eating Johnston departed Saturday for California, where he has permission to enter the Soldiers' Home. The health of the old scout has been failing very sadly for the past year, and his once powerful physique is not recognizable now in the feeble and broken-down old man who boarded Saturday's train. Yet there was a time when the name of liver-eating Johnston was a terror to the Montana Indians, many of whom his trusty rifle has assisted in their researches for a land where snow is at a premium. It was chiefly as a raconteur of the brave deeds of the past that the present generation knows the liver-eater, and his reminiscences were told with becoming modesty. From the commencement of this town, Johnston had made his home here, and it was plain to see that he was most reluctant to leave it, even when his better judgment convinced him against his will that it was the part of wisdom to accept the provision made for the nation's heroes. Indeed, it is a 2-to-1 bet that Dad Johnston will not turn around in his tracks and come back to Red Lodge to spend his few remaining days among the friends he loves, and it would not be an unwelcome sight for a good many of our best citizens to see old Liver-Eater arrive at the Red Lodge station. Red Lodge citizens were saddened to hear the news of the death of liver-eating Johnston at the National Soldiers' Home in Santa Monica, California, on Sunday, January 21, 1900, scarcely more than a month after he left Red Lodge. No doubt he died of a broken heart at having to leave his beloved Beartooth country. The Red Lodge picket printed a brief note from a Sergeant Whitehead. National Soldiers' Home, Los Angeles County, California, January 22, 1900. The editor, Red Lodge Picket. Dear Sir, thinking some of his friends might be interested and like to know, I write to inform you and them that John Johnston, better known there as Liver-Eating Johnston, died at this home yesterday, and was buried here today. In 1975, a government agency, in violation of several of its regulations, allowed the disinterment of John Johnston's body. He would have abhorred the reburial at a tourist stop near some warehouses in a Wyoming town. Nowhere can be seen his beloved Beartooths. Liver-Eating Johnston would enjoy the last laugh, however, as all that was left of his earthly remains when the grave was opened was a large leg bone and a few fragments of the cedar coffin in which he had been buried. And although this tourist stop now claims his remains, they did not capture his spirit. The spirit of John Johnston still roams wild and free over his Beartooths, and in the final reckoning, that is what really counts. So that's it for this episode about the legend and the truth of Liver-Eating Johnston. His life was the inspiration for Robert Redford's film, Jeremiah Johnson, and Redford was one of the pallbearers when he was reinterred and buried at Old Trail Town, Wyoming, which is just south of his last home in Red Lodge, Montana. Also buried at Old Trail Town are Jim White, the buffalo hunter, Jack Stillwell, Philip Vetter, W.A. Gallagher, Blind Bill Holohan, and Belle Drury. Belle Drury is the only woman buried here. She worked at Rose Williams' brothel until her and another girl were murdered in 1897. The author of the Old West Magazine article did not seem to look favorably on the reinterment of Liver-Eating Johnston. It seems like he may have thought that it was done just to set up a tourist site. It should also be noted that even though the article is titled, The Truth About Liver-Eating Johnston, that does not necessarily mean it is all true. There are no citations given for most of the accounts provided in the story, other than the reference to the memoirs of White Eye Anderson. It seems like John Johnston may not have really eaten livers, but I think it's possible that he did have a vendetta against the Crows for murdering his wife. I don't think the author of this article sufficiently disproved that account. But let us know what you think about Liver-Eating Johnston in the comments. Did he really eat the livers of Indians after he killed them? And was he really the Crow killer? This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that history channels on TV have cast aside as unworthy of their airtime. Those channels keep much of the most important history hidden from us. They are afraid to cover the truth on their channels. But here on this channel we keep this worthy history alive by reading actual historical accounts written down long ago. If you'd like to join our mission here and help keep this worthy history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to our special members-only videos that we occasionally release. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.